Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Colonial America was a land of stark contrasts, where survival was the ultimate priority, and the harsh realities of life shaped every aspect of daily existence. The image we often see of colonial life, quaint towns, peaceful farms, and tightly knit religious communities, leaves out much of the complexity and difficulty that early settlers faced. It wasn't all picturesque scenes of serene country living. Instead, life in the colonies was full of challenges, uncertainty, and transformation. One of the most significant challenges faced by colonists was survival itself. Early settlers had to contend with unfamiliar terrain, unpredictable weather, and limited resources. While the northern colonies had the advantage of cooler temperatures, which helped stave off diseases like malaria, they also faced long, bitter winters that made farming difficult. The southern colonies, on the other hand, had a much warmer climate, but they also had to deal with the sweltering heat and the threat of hurricanes, along with diseases like yellow fever and dysentery. Labor in colonial America was grueling. Most colonists worked long hours just to secure the basics for survival. In the north, the land was rocky and difficult to farm, so settlers relied on fishing, shipbuilding, and small-scale agriculture. Even here, life was labor-intensive, and most families lived in small homes with little comfort. In the south, large plantations dominated the economy, and agriculture, primarily tobacco, rice, and indigo, relied on intense labor. This is where the roots of slavery took hold, as planters turned to African slaves to provide the manpower needed to sustain these large-scale operations. The relationships between Native Americans and colonists were far more complicated than the peaceful interactions often portrayed. While some settlers managed to form alliances with native tribes for trade and mutual protection, others encroached on indigenous land, leading to bloody conflicts. The colonists' increasing demand for land and resources led to the displacement of native peoples, and in many regions, violence broke out over territorial disputes. The historical narrative is filled with stories of betrayal, survival, and a constant struggle for power between settlers and Native American groups. Slavery in colonial America was another cornerstone of the colonial economy, especially in the South. While some regions in the North saw fewer slaves, the southern colonies built their economies on the backs of African slaves who worked the plantations. Slaves were seen as property, and their brutal treatment was justified by a growing racial hierarchy. Over time, the institution of slavery would evolve into a system that dehumanized millions of people. But in its early years, it was an economic necessity that shaped both the South and the nation at large. Colonial society was also marked by a rigid class structure, with wealthy landowners at the top and indentured servants and slaves at the bottom. Even in the North, where there were fewer large plantations, a class divide existed between the wealthy merchant class and the working poor. The tension between these groups would continue to build over time, leading to future conflicts and contributing to the shaping of American society. Religion was another powerful force in shaping colonial life. In the Puritan colonies of New England, religion was all-encompassing, with strict codes of behavior and harsh punishments for those who didn't adhere to them. In contrast, the Middle colonies were more religiously diverse, with Quakers, Catholics, and Jews coexisting in a more tolerant environment. Meanwhile, the Southern colonies were predominantly Anglican, but religion played a more background role in daily life compared to the more zealous North. Geography also played a significant role in shaping different ways of life. The North had smaller farms, towns, and a more diversified economy, while the South's economy was built on large-scale plantations that relied on slave labor. The Middle colonies, with their fertile soil and strategic location, became a center of trade and commerce, blending elements of both northern and southern economies. Colonial America was a world of constant change and adaptation. The early years were marked by exploration, survival, and the establishment of trade routes, while later years saw the rise of powerful colonial elites, the growth of slavery, and the eventual push for independence. The people of the 13 colonies had to adjust to their new lives on this rugged and often dangerous frontier, but their resilience, ambition, and drive for success would shape the future of the nation. The reality of colonial life was far more complex, gritty, and fascinating than the image of a simple, rural existence often depicted in history books. The colonial period, spanning from 1607 to 1776, marks the foundation of what would eventually become the United States. It was an era of experimentation, survival, and ambition, as settlers from Europe ventured across the Atlantic to create new lives in a foreign land. The first successful colony, Jamestown, established in 1607 in what is now Virginia, faced nearly insurmountable odds. The settlers struggled with disease, famine, and hostile relations with Native American tribes. However, it was also the birthplace of tobacco cultivation, which would later become the backbone of the Southern economy. Not long after, in 1620, a group of Puritans seeking religious freedom founded Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts. Unlike Jamestown, the settlers here were motivated by a strong sense of faith and community. The Mayflower Compact, signed aboard their ship, set the stage for self-governance, reflecting the early seeds of democratic thought that would later influence the American Revolution. As the colonies expanded along the East Coast, each region began to develop its own distinct identity shaped by geography, economy, and culture. These regional differences were deeply influenced by the values and resources available in each area, leading to a patchwork of societies that would eventually become the diverse fabric of early America. The New England colonies, made up of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, were heavily influenced by the Puritan faith, which played a central role in the daily lives of colonists. Puritans sought to build a city upon a hill in which their religious beliefs would guide all aspects of life. This created a society focused on religious observance, strict moral codes, and community responsibility. Families in New England worked small farms, and the economy also thrived on industries like fishing and shipbuilding, taking advantage of the region's natural resources. New England's rocky terrain made large-scale farming difficult, so settlers relied on the sea for trade and sustenance. Towns were the heart of social and political life, and because of the Puritan emphasis on moral purity, church attendance was obligatory, with severe consequences for those who did not adhere to religious practices. In contrast, the Middle Colonies, comprising New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, were more diverse in terms of both people and religion. Unlike New England, where Puritanism dominated, the Middle Colonies were characterized by religious tolerance. The Dutch, Quakers, and Germans, among others, settled in this region, creating a melting pot of religious and cultural influences. This diversity fostered a more open and inclusive society, where people of various faiths and backgrounds could coexist. Economically, the Middle Colonies were highly productive, thanks to fertile soil ideal for farming. Grain, in particular, was a staple crop, and the region became known as the breadbasket of colonial America. The Middle Colonies also saw early industrialization, especially in cities like Philadelphia and New York, where merchants and artisans played a significant role in the economy. These cities were bustling centers of trade, commerce, and innovation, and their growing importance laid the foundation for the economic development of the United States in the years to come. Both regions contributed to the broader colonial experience, but their differences set the stage for later political, social, and economic divisions that would shape the course of American history. The Puritan-driven New England colonies developed a deeply religious and community-focused society, while the Middle Colonies embraced diversity and economic opportunity, which ultimately made them more cosmopolitan and commercially advanced. Together, these regions demonstrated the varied ways in which European settlers adapted to the New World and how their values and resources defined their ways of life. Meanwhile, the Southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia, developed an economy based on large plantations and cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. These colonies were more rural, and much of the workforce was made up of enslaved Africans, leading to a rigid class system that heavily influenced the social structure of the region. The Southern economy would become tightly intertwined with slavery, which unfortunately laid the groundwork for the tensions that would later culminate in the Civil War. As the colonies grew, so did their economic, social, and political complexity. The expansion of settlements westward, the increasing trade networks, and the introduction of new crops and goods played a role in shaping the American experience. Through quick map animations, you can see how the colonies grew and interacted with each other, forming a patchwork of distinct regions that, while bound by their British heritage, would soon grow to develop very different identities. In colonial America, Home and family life were deeply rooted in survival, tradition, and hard work. Housing varied depending on the region, but one thing was consistent: it was functional. The early settlers had to build homes quickly and often, with whatever materials they could find. In the north and in the frontier areas, log cabins were common, simple but sturdy structures made from timber, often with a thatched roof or sometimes a more durable bark roof. In contrast, wealthier families in urban areas like New York or Philadelphia might live in townhouses made of brick or stone, offering a bit more comfort and privacy. These homes were generally modest, but they provided shelter from the harsh conditions settlers had to face. Family life was at the heart of colonial society, and families were typically large. In fact, it was not unusual for families to have 10 or more children. The high birth rate was necessary to help populate the colonies and ensure that there was enough labor to maintain farms and other businesses. The family unit was not just a social structure. It was an economic one, too. Families depended on each other for survival, and every member played a vital role. In colonial America, gender roles were sharply defined, and societal expectations dictated distinct responsibilities for men and women, both within the family and the broader community. These roles were largely shaped by the needs of survival and the agricultural, craft-based economies that dominated life in the 13 colonies. Men were typically seen as the head of the household and the primary breadwinners. Their duties were centered around physically demanding labor that could range from farming to working skilled trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, and later, shipbuilding. These tasks required not only strength and skill, but also long hours and a deep connection to the land or craft. In rural areas, men were often responsible for clearing land, planting crops, and maintaining the family's economic viability through activities like livestock care and the selling of produce or goods. As communities grew, men became more involved in public life, attending town meetings, negotiating trade deals, or serving in local government. Their work was visible and public, reinforcing the idea that men were the key economic and social figures in colonial society. Women, on the other hand, were primarily confined to the private sphere of the household. They managed the home and everything that went into making it function smoothly. Cooking, cleaning, spinning yarn, and sewing were essential daily tasks that kept the family fed, clothed, and comfortable. Women's responsibilities also extended to running the household. Garden, where they grew vegetables and herbs for food, medicine, and other necessities. They were expected to raise children, manage household finances, and maintain social relationships through hosting visitors and participating in community events. In many cases, women also helped produce goods for trade, such as candles, soap, baskets, and clothing, which provided additional income for the family. Despite their heavy workload and critical role in ensuring the family's well-being, women's contributions were often underappreciated and overshadowed by the public duties of men. Their labor, while essential, was considered private and less prestigious. The idea of woman's work became intertwined with the idea of domesticity, reinforcing the notion that a woman's place was in the home, and her value was tied to her ability to manage it effectively. Women's roles were also bound by legal and social restrictions. They had limited property rights and were often dependent on their husbands or male relatives for financial security. However, within these strict gender roles, women still found ways to exert influence and form networks of support. They played pivotal roles in educating children, organizing social gatherings, and, in some cases, shaping the local community's moral and religious practices. Women in New England, for instance, were often the backbone of religious life, running church activities, teaching children, and maintaining the community's spiritual well-being. In the southern colonies, women were often in charge of managing large plantations, including overseeing enslaved labor, though they still worked within the confines of societal expectations of domesticity. While colonial gender roles were rigid, they were not static. As the colonies grew and developed, women found new opportunities for influence, especially in times of crisis, war, or economic upheaval. Nonetheless, the foundational gender divisions remained largely intact, shaping the early structure of American society and leaving a legacy that would influence gender expectations for centuries to come. Children, though expected to help around the house from a very young age, were often seen as small adults in training. By the age of 6 or 7, children had daily chores to assist with, from tending animals to gathering firewood. By the time they reached their teenage years, they were expected to take on larger responsibilities, often contributing to the family's farm or business and preparing to manage their own households. In many cases, children were expected to marry young, particularly in the more rural areas, where starting a family and raising crops were seen as essential to survival. Living history museums today give us a glimpse into these homes, with interiors showcasing the limited yet resourceful ways that colonial families made do. The hearth was the heart of the home, used for heating, cooking, and even sometimes sleeping during the cold winter months. From furniture to cooking utensils, everything in the house was designed to be practical, built to last, and often homemade. These living history reenactments show the ingenuity and resilience of colonial families, painting a vivid picture of what daily life was like in these early American homes. In colonial America, the economy was predominantly agrarian, but it was shaped by distinct regional differences that reflected the diverse geography, climate, and resources available to settlers. The northern colonies, in particular, developed an economy that was a mix of agriculture, industry, and trade, driven by both necessity and the challenges posed by the environment. In the northern colonies, especially in New England, the land was often rocky and the winters long and harsh, making large-scale farming difficult. As a result, many settlers focused on subsistence farming, growing just enough food to feed their families. Common crops included corn, beans, wheat, and vegetables, but the growing season was shorter than in the South, so food production could never be as extensive. While farmers in New England might occasionally produce surplus crops to trade, agriculture alone was not sufficient to sustain the economy. To make a living, northern colonists had to diversify their economic activities. Fishing played a major role, particularly along the coastline, where abundant fish like cod, herring, and mackerel were caught and salted for preservation. The fishing industry was not just important for local consumption, but also for export, with fish being shipped back to Europe and the Caribbean. This made New England a crucial player in the Atlantic trade network, especially as the demand for dried fish grew. Shipbuilding was another critical industry in the northern colonies, especially in New England. The region's vast forests, which provided abundant timber, were ideal for building sturdy ships. Shipyards in places like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut became busy centers for ship construction, producing vessels used for trade, fishing, and exploration. These ships were vital for connecting the colonies with Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean, fostering a thriving maritime economy. The demand for ships also led to the growth of associated industries such as sailmaking, rope manufacturing, and ironworks, further diversifying the economy. In addition to fishing and shipbuilding, small-scale manufacturing and crafts flourished in New England. Artisans and craftsmen produced a wide variety of goods, including textiles, leather products, furniture, and tools. These items were either used locally or traded with other colonies in Europe. New England also had a strong tradition of milling, with watermills used to grind grain into flour, as well as sawmills to process timber. This blend of agriculture, fishing, shipbuilding, and manufacturing helped create a more diversified economy in the northern colonies. Unlike the southern colonies, where large-scale plantation agriculture dominated and relied heavily on enslaved labor, the northern economy was based on a mixture of smaller, independent farms and commercial industries. This economic diversification allowed the northern colonies to be less dependent on agriculture alone and to create a more resilient and dynamic economy, which would later help fuel their involvement in trade and the Industrial Revolution. The southern colonies, in contrast, were built around plantations, which produced cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. These plantations were huge operations that required extensive labor, and the climate in the South was ideal for cultivating these crops. The plantations were economically self-sustaining, but also relied heavily on trade with Britain for tools, luxury goods, and other imports. The agricultural economy in the South led to the development of a highly stratified society, where wealthy plantation owners held significant power, while poor farmers, indentured servants, and enslaved people formed the backbone of the labor force. In between, the middle colonies, with their fertile soil, produced abundant crops like grains, and cities like Philadelphia and New York became important trade hubs, with commerce serving as a key aspect of their economy. But no matter the region, trades were vital to colonial life. In the towns and cities, Skilled tradesmen like blacksmiths, coopers, and printers played an important role in day-to-day life. Blacksmiths forged tools, horseshoes, and weapons, while coopers made barrels to store everything from food to rum. Printers were especially important, as they produced newspapers and pamphlets that helped spread news and ideas throughout the colonies, setting the stage for the political revolutions to come. Markets were crucial to the colonial economy, and the system of commerce was based heavily on bartering, particularly in rural areas where currency was scarce. People exchanged goods like grain, livestock, and handmade products. In the cities, however, currency was more common, and a growing merchant class participated in transatlantic trade, importing British goods and exporting the raw materials the colonies produced, such as tobacco and cotton. One of the darkest and most important economic realities of colonial America was the use of enslaved labor, particularly in the southern colonies. As plantations grew larger and the demand for labor increased, slave labor became integral to the economy. Africans were forcibly brought to the colonies through the transatlantic slave trade, and they worked the fields on tobacco and rice plantations, under brutal conditions. In addition to agricultural work, enslaved people were also used for domestic labor in wealthier homes and for labor in the burgeoning urban centers. Slavery was not only a moral injustice, but also the engine that drove the Southern economy, deeply influencing the development of American society. The brutal exploitation of enslaved labor would become a foundational issue in the tensions between the colonies and Britain, and later between the North and South, as the nation's ideals of freedom and liberty clashed with the institution of slavery. In colonial America, food and daily routines were shaped by practicality and the harsh realities of survival in a new and often unpredictable environment. Meals were generally simple and hearty, made from locally available ingredients, and were adapted to the challenges of each region. The types of food people ate and how they prepared it varied significantly between the North and the South, driven by both geography and the available resources. In the northern colonies, where farming was less productive due to the rocky soil and long winters, families often relied on foods that could be easily grown or preserved. Corn, beans, and root vegetables were staples in many households, providing the necessary calories to sustain families through the harsh New England winters. Corn was particularly important, used in a variety of ways, such as in cornbread, porridge, and the famous corn pone. Stews and soups were common, made from these ingredients and any meat that could be hunted or raised, such as chicken, pork, or, on rare occasions, beef. Given the colder climate, food preservation was vital, so techniques like salting, pickling, and smoking were commonly used to extend the shelf life of meats and vegetables. One of the region's signature drinks was cider, made from apples grown in orchards or foraged from wild trees. It was often fermented into hard cider, which became an important beverage in many northern households, especially during the fall when apples were harvested in abundance. Additionally, molasses, brought from the Caribbean, was used in cooking and baking, adding a distinctive sweetness to many northern dishes. In the southern colonies, the climate allowed for more diverse crops to be grown, leading to a broader variety of foods on the table. Cornbread remained a staple in the South as well, alongside rice, which became a key crop in the region, particularly in South Carolina and Georgia. Rice was often eaten with vegetables such as collard greens, sweet potatoes, and beans, creating a rich, hearty base for many Southern meals. The Southern diet was more varied due to the region's access to a greater variety of agricultural products. Wealthier families had the luxury of eating more meat, such as beef, which was less common in the North, while pork and chicken were regular staples. The Southern climate also allowed for the cultivation of crops like tobacco, indigo, and sugar, which not only contributed to the region's economy but also influenced the flavors of food. Spices such as cayenne pepper, cinnamon, and cloves found their way into many Southern dishes, giving the cuisine a distinctive, bolder taste compared to the more straightforward meals of the North. The Southern diet was also impacted by the presence of enslaved Africans, whose culinary traditions and knowledge of cooking techniques were integrated into the foodways of the region. African ingredients like okra and certain types of beans, as well as cooking methods such as frying and slow cooking, became integral parts of Southern cuisine, influencing dishes like gumbo and jambalaya. Throughout the colonies, daily routines were structured around the hard work required for survival. Men typically worked the fields or engaged in trades, while women managed the home, prepared meals, and cared for the children. In the South, where large plantations were common, women often managed household tasks and oversaw the care of enslaved laborers, who worked in the fields and performed much of the manual labor. In both regions, the rhythms of the seasons dictated daily life, with harvests, planting, and preservation cycles taking up much of the year. Food in colonial America was much more than sustenance. It was a reflection of the land, climate, and culture of each region. In the North, meals were simple and focused on survival, relying on what could be grown or hunted. In the South, a greater abundance of crops and meats allowed for more variety, and Southern cuisine began to take shape with its distinct blend of flavors, ingredients, and cultural influences. Regardless of the region, food was a central part of daily life, and the routines surrounding its preparation were a crucial aspect of the survival and success of the colonies. Cooking in colonial America was an all-day affair, conducted primarily over an open hearth or in a Dutch oven. The hearth, a massive stone or brick structure, was the center of the home, where cooking, heating, and sometimes even sleeping took place during cold months. The fireplace was used for everything from roasting meats to boiling stews. Dutch ovens, heavy cast-iron pots with a tight-fitting lid, were perfect for slow-cooking stews and baking bread, as they could be placed directly in the embers or hung over the fire. Cooking required a great deal of time and attention, with women or older children often spending most of the day tending the fire and preparing food, since meals were not made in the quick, modern way we're accustomed to today. The daily routine in colonial America followed a strict rhythm tied to the rising and setting of the sun. Workdays typically began at sunrise and stretched until sunset, leaving little room for leisure. In agricultural communities, much of the day was spent working the land, plowing fields, planting crops, or tending to livestock. In the cities or more industrialized areas, people worked as tradesmen, in shops, or in markets. For the families who worked the land, the work was backbreaking and constant, with the changing seasons marking different tasks, from planting and harvesting crops to preparing food and preserving it for the winter. Children were expected to help from a young age, doing chores like gathering firewood, fetching water, or helping with the animals. The physical nature of this work meant that the rhythm of the day was shaped by the need to survive, with little time for rest or personal pursuits outside of maintaining the home and farm. In the evenings, after the work was done, families would gather together around the hearth to share their meals. The simple joys of family and community were some of the few comforts in an otherwise demanding daily existence. However, the harshness of life meant that leisure was rare and often only found during seasonal breaks or religious holidays, when work could take a pause. Still, the routine of work, food preparation, and family interaction formed the backbone of colonial American life. Religion played a central role in colonial American life, with different regions influenced by distinct religious traditions that shaped daily life, laws, and community dynamics. In New England, the Puritans held significant sway, and their strict religious beliefs permeated every aspect of society. The Puritans believed in a very disciplined, devout life and sought to create a city upon a hill as an example of Christian purity. Their moral codes were rigid, with strict Sabbath laws that prohibited work, recreation, and even some forms of entertainment on Sundays. Any deviation from these laws was seen as sinful and often met with punishment. The Puritans' intense focus on religious discipline and community responsibility created a society that was tightly bound by moral expectations. In the Middle Colonies, the Quakers, primarily in Pennsylvania, held a unique place in the religious landscape. Quakers, also known as the Religious Society of Friends, were known for their belief in equality, pacifism, and simplicity in worship. They rejected formal clergy and sought a more personal, direct connection with God. This led to a society that was more tolerant of different beliefs and practices, allowing for greater diversity in religious thought compared to the more strict Puritans in the North. Meanwhile, in the Southern colonies, Anglicanism was the dominant religion. The Anglican Church, the Church of England, was closely tied to the British monarchy, and its influence in the Southern colonies was strong, especially among the wealthy plantation owners. While less strict than the Puritans, Anglicans still followed a formal church structure and were guided by the English Book of Common Prayer. Religion not only shaped the moral and social structure of colonial life, but also dictated the rhythms of daily activity. The Sabbath was a sacred day, and the Puritans and Anglicans adhered to its observance with great seriousness. Religious services were lengthy, often taking up much of the day, and it was common for families to gather in church for sermons, prayers, and hymns. Sunday was reserved for religious reflection, and laws regulating the Sabbath were strictly enforced with fines or other punishments for those who violated the sanctity of the day. Education, while valued, varied significantly depending on region and social class. In New England, where Puritan influence was strong, education was emphasized, and children were taught to read so they could understand the Bible. Many families had access to basic schooling, and schools were often run by religious organizations. The Puritans even established Harvard College in 1636 to train ministers. For young children, the first step in education was often the horn book, a wooden board with a handle and a sheet of paper showing the alphabet, religious prayers, and sometimes simple arithmetic. It was a tool for learning to read and write, basic skills that were essential in Puritan communities for religious participation. In rural areas and the southern colonies, education was more sporadic. With fewer schools and less infrastructure, many children received informal education at home or in small one-room schoolhouses. These schoolhouses were often located in villages or towns and had a single teacher who would instruct children of all ages. The curriculum was typically basic, focusing on reading, writing, and arithmetic, although education beyond that was often reserved for the wealthier classes. Literacy rates in some areas were relatively low, especially in the South, where large numbers of people, especially enslaved individuals, were denied access to education. In contrast, wealthier families in urban areas might have private tutors, or send their children to more formal schools. Despite the differences in access and quality, education played a crucial role in shaping the moral and intellectual life of the colonies, as settlers understood the importance of learning to navigate both the physical and spiritual challenges they faced. However, it's important to note that for many, the role of religion often took precedence over formal education, and much of the learning that took place in early colonial society was religious in nature. Law and order in colonial America were rooted in the traditions of English common law, but were heavily influenced by local customs, religious beliefs, and the needs of a growing diverse population. Local governments were the primary means of maintaining order, and their structure often reflected the values of the communities they governed. In New England, town meetings were a cornerstone of local governance. These meetings, held in public, spaces like meeting houses, allowed free male property owners to come together to make decisions about issues like taxes, local laws, and communal work projects. Town meetings were seen as a form of direct democracy, where people had a say in how their communities were run, although it's important to note that only white land-owning men could participate. In the southern and middle colonies, local governance took a slightly different form, with colonial assemblies becoming more common. These assemblies were composed of elected officials who made laws, levied taxes, and oversaw the operation of their respective colonies. The southern colonies, with their large landowners and plantation economy, often had a more aristocratic style of governance. Power was concentrated in the hands of wealthy plantation owners who wielded significant influence over local politics and law. Colonial assemblies, though an important part of governance, were often heavily influenced by the British Crown, and the governor, appointed by the monarchy, held substantial power in colonial matters. Punishments for breaking the law in colonial America were swift and often harsh. There were few protections for individual rights, and punishment was designed to be a public deterrent. Common forms of punishment included the stocks, where criminals were locked in wooden structures with their hands and feet bound, subjecting them to public ridicule and sometimes physical abuse. Public shaming was another common form of punishment. Those convicted of minor offenses like theft, slander, or gossip might be paraded through town with a sign that indicated their crime, making them the object of public scorn. In more serious cases, punishment could include corporal punishment such as whipping, branding, or even execution, especially for crimes seen as threatening to the stability of society, like treason or murder. The strict moral and legal codes that governed life in colonial America came to a head during events like the Salem witch trials, which remain one of the most notorious examples of legal overreach and the dangers of mass hysteria. In 1692, in the Puritan community of Salem Village, now Salem, Massachusetts, a group of young girls began accusing women in the community of witchcraft, sparking a wave of panic. The trials, fueled by religious fervor, fear of the devil, and existing social tensions, led to the execution of 20 people, most of them women, and the imprisonment of many others. The legal system at the time allowed for spectral evidence, where testimony about visions or dreams could be used as proof of witchcraft, making it nearly impossible for the accused to defend themselves. The Salem witch trials stand as a dark example of how fear, religion, and law intersected to create a climate where justice was deeply compromised. The trials were eventually discredited, and public sentiment turned against the judges and accusers. However, the damage was done, and the event had lasting repercussions on the legal and religious landscape of the colonies. It highlighted the dangers of mob justice, the lack of proper legal procedures, and the willingness of the authorities to bend the law in the face of fear. The Salem witch trials remain a stark reminder of how the pursuit of order and morality can sometimes devolve into a miscarriage of justice when a legal system is manipulated by emotion and superstition. In colonial America, culture, clothing, and entertainment were heavily influenced by the social hierarchy, regional differences, and the availability of resources. Fashion was a reflection of both class and region, with wealthier individuals able to afford more elaborate clothing, while poorer settlers had to make do with simpler, more practical attire. In the New England and Middle colonies, especially, among the Puritans and Quakers, clothing was modest and utilitarian. Men wore woolen or linen shirts, breeches, waistcoats, and coats, while women donned long dresses with high collars and simple bonnets. The focus was on modesty and practicality rather than decoration. In contrast, the southern colonies, with their wealth from large plantations, saw a more elaborate style of dress, especially among the upper classes. Wealthy landowners and their families wore finer fabrics such as silk, velvet, and imported textiles. Men's coats were often richly decorated with embroidery, and women wore gowns with intricate lace and jewelry. The difference in clothing between classes was stark, with the lower classes and enslaved people wearing rough, homemade garments, often of homespun fabric or burlap. Music, storytelling, and dances were integral parts of colonial entertainment, helping people relax and connect with each other after long days of labor. Music was often passed down through generations, with early settlers bringing their own folk songs, hymns, and instruments from Europe. In New England, religious hymns were a central part of life, with congregations singing together in church services. Folk music was also common, and instruments like fiddles, flutes, and drums were used to accompany dances and gatherings. In the South, African rhythms and songs began to mix with European musical traditions, creating unique blends that would later influence American music styles. Storytelling played a major role in colonial culture. With limited access to printed materials and entertainment, people gathered around hearths or at town meetings to share stories, legends, and news. These stories ranged from family histories and moral lessons to the tales of Native American legends, European folk tales, and supernatural events. Storytellers often used these gatherings to pass down traditions, values, and history to the younger generations. Dances were also an important form of entertainment, especially in more rural areas. In both the northern and southern colonies, traditional European dances like the minuet and the gavotte were popular among the upper classes, but they were adapted to the local environment. At community gatherings and balls, these dances allowed colonists to socialize and unwind. In the southern colonies, more informal dances like the lively square dances became popular. African-influenced dances also began to take hold in southern social circles, influencing both Black and white communities. Seasonal festivals and gatherings were important events in the colonial calendar. Harvest festivals, religious observances, and holiday celebrations brought entire communities together to celebrate the seasons. Thanksgiving, first celebrated by the Pilgrims in Plymouth, was a time for feasting, music, and giving thanks. Other seasonal gatherings included spring dances, fairs, and religious holidays, which were observed with religious services, feasting, and of course dancing. In the more rural parts of the colonies, especially in New England, winter was a time for house parties and gatherings that helped combat the isolation of harsh winters. These events were occasions for food, drink, games, and bonding among neighbors. Life in colonial America, despite the hardships of survival and hard work, was also filled with moments of celebration, community connection, and cultural expression. These traditions of music, dance, and storytelling not only provided much-needed entertainment, but also helped to shape the cultural identity of the colonies, laying the groundwork for the diverse American culture that would emerge in the centuries to come. Life in colonial America was undeniably difficult, marked by numerous challenges and hardships that tested the resilience of settlers. Disease was one of the most persistent and deadly threats. In the absence of modern medicine, outbreaks of smallpox, dysentery, typhoid, and other infectious diseases were common, and they often spread quickly through communities. Mortality rates were high, especially in the early years of settlement. In many cases, entire families were wiped out by illness, leaving towns and villages devastated. Epidemics could wipe out a significant portion of a colony's population, and medical care was rudimentary, relying on herbs, prayers, and the limited knowledge of local healers. Childbirth, especially for women in rural areas, was another major risk. Without proper medical attention, many women died in childbirth, and the infant mortality rate was also high. For settlers, the prospect of losing a child or a spouse due to disease or childbirth was a constant, grim reality. In addition to disease, the settlers in colonial America faced frequent and violent conflicts with indigenous peoples. Early interactions between settlers and Native Americans were often cooperative, as Native tribes taught settlers how to grow crops and provided food and guidance. However, as the colonial population grew and settlers expanded their land claims, tensions mounted. The encroachment on native lands, as well as differences in cultural values, led to a series of wars and violent conflicts. Notable examples include the Pequot War, King Philip's War, and various skirmishes along the frontier. These conflicts resulted in devastating loss of life for both the settlers and native communities, and they drastically altered the dynamics of the land. For many Native American tribes, the arrival of European settlers and the subsequent wars led to displacement, loss of land, and a significant decrease in population due to violence and disease brought by Europeans. Harsh weather. Conditions also played a crucial role in the daily struggles of colonial America. The settlers were entirely at the mercy of nature, and survival depended on their ability to adapt to the changing seasons. Winters in the northern colonies could be brutally cold, making it difficult to grow crops, gather food, or even stay warm. The risk of starvation loomed large during these months, and many families faced the challenge of managing dwindling food supplies through the winter. Similarly, in the southern colonies, while the winters were milder, summers brought sweltering heat and intense humidity that could destroy crops, leading to food shortages and economic hardship. Crop failures were a constant threat, especially given the reliance on agriculture for survival. Early colonists often struggled to cultivate the land, and the soil was sometimes poor or unsuitable for the crops they attempted to grow. Droughts, floods, and pests further complicated farming efforts. In the southern colonies, where cash crops like tobacco and rice were the economic backbone, the threat of crop failure could be devastating. For those in the north, shorter growing seasons and rocky soil made agriculture even more challenging. The combination of disease, conflicts with indigenous peoples, unpredictable weather, and crop failures created a constant undercurrent of uncertainty in colonial America. These hardships demanded incredible resilience from the settlers, many of whom were forced to contend with loss, hardship, and the harsh realities of life in a new and often hostile environment. Despite these challenges, however, the settlers' perseverance and ability to adapt would ultimately shape the growth of the colonies and the foundations of the future United States. The legacy of colonial life is deeply embedded in early American identity and continues to influence the culture, values, and institutions of the United States today. Colonial culture laid the foundation for many aspects of American society, including the emphasis on self-reliance, community involvement, and individual rights. The sense of independence that grew from the harsh realities of colonial life, along with the settlers' struggles for religious freedom and political representation, contributed to the ideals that would later shape the American Revolution and the founding of the nation. Many of the practices from colonial life, such as town meetings, local governance, and the importance of education, have persisted in American culture. The colonial emphasis on hard work, resourcefulness, and resilience can still be seen in the American work ethic and entrepreneurial spirit. Additionally, the regional and cultural diversity that began in colonial America set the stage for the multicultural society that the U.S. would eventually become. The colonial mindset, focused on adaptation and survival, offers valuable lessons for today. It teaches the importance of community, the need for perseverance in the face of adversity, and the value of self-sufficiency. While the context has changed, the fundamental principles of resilience and innovation that characterized colonial life remain relevant in modern American society. In conclusion, colonial America was a land defined by struggle, resilience, and a strong sense of community. The settlers faced countless hardships, from disease and harsh weather to conflicts with indigenous peoples, yet their perseverance and determination helped shape the nation we know today. The culture, values, and way of life in the colonies laid the foundation for the United States, influencing everything from governance to personal freedoms. Now, I want to hear from you. Which colony would you have wanted to live in? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold history and deep dives into America's past.